and a very warm welcome to Moneycontrol.com. So what is a budget? Budget is essentially a fiscal policy, just the way the RBI comes out with a monetary policy. Budget is a fiscal policy that outlines the spending and the revenue for the government. The budget is essentially a document where the government puts out where it will spend the money that it gets from different sources, that is the revenues it will earn. Now, your first ready reckoner to what the budget means is to look at budget at a glance. That's part of the finance minister's speech. So you look at budget at a glance, where you'll have different columns. So you look at actual figures, you look at budget estimates, and you look at revised estimates. Now, what's the difference between actual figures, budget estimates, and revised estimates? Actual figures is the money that has actually been spent. Budget figures is actually the money that was budgeted. Now, this typically happens, depending on calculations, and it happens at the start of the year. Considering the budget is going to be presented on the 1st of February, Finance Minister and her team has a very daunting task of estimating what the tax revenues are going to be like, what the growth is going to be like, what's the expenditure that they intend to take. So these are all budget estimates. And then you have revised estimates. Revised estimates are put out 9 months after the completion, which is typically the time around which your budget is presented. All these figures are in rupees, in crores of rupees. First number for you to look at is revenue receipts. Now, what do you mean by revenue receipts? Revenue receipts is typically revenue which comes regularly. In our case, our revenue receipts would be, say, salaries, because they come regularly. So for the government, you have to look at the revenue receipts. For the government, of course, the revenue that comes regularly is taxes, whether it is income tax, personal income tax, corporate taxes across the board. So these are the kind of taxes that come in regularly. So that's a regular source of income for the government. Higher the revenue receipts, the better it is for the government. If the government has done better than what it had anticipated, you will see higher revenue receipts, and that's a good sign. That's a good number to look at. Then there is revenue expenditure, which are again regular expenses. So for instance, in our case, those regular expenses would be rent or mortgage payments or petrol bills, so on and so forth. So like that, government also has revenue expenditure, which is expenditure it has to make just to keep the government running. Then you have to make sure when you're looking at these two data sets, you have to see what's the gap between the revenue receipts and revenue expenditure. For instance, if your revenue is 100 and if your revenue expenditure is 105, that's not a good sign. So typically, and that comes down to how households are run too, right? You earn a certain amount, but you spend less than that. So that's called a good budget, and that holds true for the Indian government as well. As it often happens, and as it's been happening over years, our revenue receipts are less than our revenue expenditure. So where does that money come from? That surplus that we need, where will it come from? Then also there is capital expenditure that the government will have to incur, which is separate from revenue expenditure. Revenue expenditure is expenditure that you undertake to keep things going. Capital expenditure is something that you undertake to build assets. So that's a separate head of expenditure. Over the past few years, we have seen, of course, barring the 2 years of the pandemic, that there has been a decline in the revenue deficit, which means the gap between the revenue expenditure and revenue receipts has been declining, which is a good sign. Then you also, in terms of your expenditure, you also have money which is given to the states. That's a separate head, money given to the states. Now, the money that's given to the states for capital expenditure shows up as revenue expenditure for the government, but in the state's budget, it will show up as capital expenditure. So that's the difference. So we need to look at how we're financing that revenue deficit. Are we borrowing heavily from the market? Because very heavy market borrowings is never a good idea. And if we are borrowing from the market, what are we spending that money on? That's also very, very critical. Market borrowings is something that all governments undertake, and the Indian government has also been undertaking extensive market borrowings, primarily because of a whole host of schemes that were announced, and the pandemic disrupted a lot of things. In fact, for this fiscal, we are looking at market borrowings between 12 to 13.5 lakh crore. Now, what portion of that is going to fund your revenue expenditure? That's very, very important. Are you borrowing just to keep your home running, or are you borrowing to build assets? If you're borrowing to increase your capital expenditure, then it's good borrowing. But if you're borrowing to fund your revenue deficit, to just make sure that to just take care of your basic expenses, then that's not a good sign. And from before 2 years ago, the government was gradually bringing down its revenue deficit, which was a very good sign. And it had clearly stated that it wants to be on the path of fiscal consolidation, which means not spending blindly and keeping expenditure under check. This government has also re-engineered its spending greatly towards building infrastructure and capital expenditure. So this budget will be interesting to watch out for, because our fiscal deficit is uncomfortably high. We are running behind our consolidation timeline that we had set for ourselves, but the pandemic discounts a lot of that. Having said that, growth is expected to slow down. When we say growth is expected to slow down, it is going to impact our tax revenues, that is the revenues that the government will make. It will impact a lot of other things, but expenditure will remain. So how will government do the stuff balancing act? Now, these are the things to watch out for when you read the budget. You look at what the revised estimates were, what are the actual numbers. You look at the revenue deficit, that is how much money is the government getting through revenue receipts and how much is it spending on revenue expenditure. You look at capital expenditure. If that's going up, that's a good sign, because that's creation of assets. And you look at fiscal deficit, and you look at market borrowings. How much is the government borrowing, and how much of that money is being used for interest payments, that is to pay interest on the loans that the government has already taken. That's also a very, very important sign. Thanks for watching.
1st February 2023, the Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman will present the last full union budget before 2024 elections. India's most awaited financial event comes in the midst of global slowdown, inflation, liquidity tightening, geopolitical tensions, and re-emergence of COVID-19. Will India look to fire up its manufacturing? Will India build a moat against global uncertainties? What will the budget have for the middle class? Watch the complete coverage of Budget 2023. Real-time analysis, expert takes all day on Moneycontrol. Log on to www.moneycontrol.com for more.